So the portion of the story that I have up on the screen right now, of the Believer story, the Geneva Believer story, is the portion that looks at the editorial board piece by the Finger Lakes Times that ran, I believe, in early June. The print's too small. I can't read it from here. Let's welcome the FLX Welcome Center, something to that effect.
Right.
So I remember in that piece there being a lot of felt like frustration with some of the folks who frequently come out against various things that the city does, or whatever the case may be. It painted, in my opinion, the paper into a really tough corner, because the newspaper is supposed to be the watchdog of, as the Believer pointed out, the establishment, or, read whatever community you're in. Yeah. Supposed to be reporting objectively on it, and it seemed to take a firm stance. I have a column that runs in the Finger Lakes Times. I have a good relationship with most of the folks up there, and, everything is hunky-dory on that front. But I think this is, in this era where, journalists aren't just the folks who work in newspapers. They're on social media. They are everywhere. It's anybody who basically wants to take the time, like Jim Meany does with the Geneva Believer, to dig into issues of importance in the local community.
Right.
And making a stance through an editorial board, taking a stance, I think is an incredibly, incredibly risky thing to do, because it opens yourself up to a whole lot of things. It's similar. I feel similarly to this as I do about newspaper endorsements. We're going to be seeing those again in a couple months. And frankly, I just, in this day and age, 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think there was a place for it. And I've written a column about this too in the newspaper. There's a time and a place. And I'm not entirely sure that newspapers, or any news organization in general, especially with the level of scrutiny that we see every single day regardless, I'm just not sure there's any space for it now.
Now, see, I might disagree with that, because in general, I think the idea of looking at the newspaper as the fourth estate, the idea that they are keeping people honest, double-checking the facts, reporting the facts, keeping people informed, needs to stay the central focus. I think where we find difficulty, I think an editorial board and an editorial position fits with that, insofar as if one agency has been repeatedly, consistently, thoroughly reporting the facts about what's going on, then I do think there is a level of public trust and interest in people hearing what the people who are following it closely think. So that's about like endorsements in general, that I think if the paper is doing a good job of thoroughly and completely getting the news out there in an objective way about what's really going on, then I think the endorsements and editorial content fit nicely with that.
See, I just want to jump in quickly, because I think that's based on the idea that from an era when newspapers were much more representative of the entire community.
Right.
And much larger newsrooms, much larger reach, much larger audiences. That's changed. That dynamic is gone. So what is it really representing at that point? You can have a handful of reporters, and this goes for even some of the larger newsrooms now, which really still aren't that large. You have a few people really investigating, really reporting on something, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it was an effort of the entire newsroom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Dozens of people, and that dynamic is gone, and that's what worries me when, we're in this situation. You hear a lot of the criticism of newspapers and of news organizations in general for being slanted one way. It's because people don't feel like they're representative of the entire community. And that dynamic, I think, is really, it's such a fine line to walk that I just personally, I look at it and it's like, it can't be worth it.
Yeah. I mean, that is a question, whether or not it's worth it, whether it actually is in the paper's best interest to take a position. those are definitely questions above my expertise and pay grade. But I think that, I think in general, the reason maybe that Welcome Center editorial rubbed people the wrong way is that it would have been one thing if there had been a series of articles about the Welcome Center contracts, how the work was going, how it was bid out, just general, what I guess people would say is dry news, just about what the process is. And then, if at the end of the day, the paper wants to come out and say, this is great and everything went well and hooray for us, I think people could appreciate that, because the question of whether or not the Welcome Center is a good thing, an asset, something to be proud of, is entirely separate from how the Welcome Center was developed, how the project progressed, whether or not anybody was unduly enriched for the level of work that was completed. Those are separate questions. So I think the pushback is not so much that the Finger Lakes Times said something, it's that they chose to say what they felt about the project without really giving people enough about what was really going on with the project.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't think we've seen the last of this.
Right.
I think this is probably this is going to keep going. This one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sad for the Finger Lakes Times that the Geneva Believer scooped the story about the FOIL request. I don't know if the Finger Lakes Times put in a FOIL request, but for me, the logical next move after seeing that WHEC story was, well, what about Geneva's money? And I think that was on the minds of a lot of people. So for Jim to have gone and done that legwork and to have this story, for me, I always tell people, subscribe to the paper, right? Like this the best way to get the best journalism is to support better journalism, right? To put more money into the coffers so that there can be more time and attention for more in-depth stuff. But I don't know. I mean, I think the Finger Lakes Times has such a large coverage area that they do a good job covering what they have to cover. But on an issue like this, I can understand the criticism because it does look like they missed a big story.